Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this important session. We have the honor and we're delighted to have for the second consecutive year the Secretary General of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, Mr. Mathias Cormann. Sir, we thank you very much for joining us this year again.
Great to be here.
And actually, I understand that your visit last year was quite fruitful and good.
All my visits to Greece are fruitful.
Because you have had very interesting discussions with our Prime Minister, which ended up, thanks also to the very hard work of Mr. George Prevellakis, the Ambassador of OECD. I understand you have a new ambassador now, George Pagoulatos. So to become an ambassador in OECD from Greece, it is a prerequisite to be a George. Without George, you don't accept any ambassador. But anyway,
you can say that. I couldn't possibly comment.
Yes, because it is someone else who decides on this. But thank you very much. So it was a very interesting discussion that you have had with the Prime Minister. You established a few months ago the research center in Crete. With Mr. Prevellakis a few months ago, we have had a very interesting meeting in Chania. So I think new days and a new era starts between OECD and Greece. Before we'll go, of course, to the further discussion, I would like you to make your comments. We thank you very much for your participation again. We enjoyed your comments last night, about the world economy, but the floor is yours, and I would like to invite everyone to welcome the Secretary to the podium. Please join me to welcome him.
Well, thank you so much for the warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, friends all. Thank you for inviting me back. It's always good when you're welcome a second time. And it's great to have the opportunity to make a few observations here at this 8th edition of the Delphi Economic Forum. It sadly remains a statement of the obvious that we are meeting at what continues to be a very challenging time for the world economy in the wake of the worst pandemic in 100 years and of course in the context and against the backdrop of the continuing war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine. And while the outlook for the global economy has improved ever so slightly in recent months, it remains fragile with risks tilted to the downside. The slight improvement that we see is primarily driven by improved business and consumer confidence, declining food and energy prices, and the full reopening of the Chinese economy. We do project global growth to remain at below trend rates of 2.6% this year and 2.9% next year. But let me pause here, though, to say that we do continue to project global growth because of some of the commentary in recent months speculating about the R word and making various very pessimistic predictions. We see as our base scenario still our expectation as being a continuous growth in the global economy. And we do expect a gradual improvement in global growth throughout 23-24 as the drag on incomes from high inflation gradually recedes. On inflation, it remains too high, is not coming down by enough, fast enough. We project headline inflation across G20 countries to decline from 8.1% last year to 5.9% this year and 4.5% next year, which means that for many countries, inflation will still be above target at the end of next year. Core inflation, that is inflation excluding prices for energy and food, remains especially sticky on the back of strong service price increases, something more effective competition policies could and should help address. And of course, the cost pressures from tight labour markets. And we've got very tight labour markets after a pandemic, with everything that's going on, high inflation, tight labour markets. There is a continuing uncertainty about the course of the war in Ukraine. there are the intensifying geopolitical tensions elsewhere. The strength of the impact of monetary policy tightening is difficult to gauge in real time, with a narrow path to a soft landing. Furthermore, the necessary and unavoidable decisions to tackle inflation by further tightening monetary policy will continue to increase the risk of exposing pre-existing vulnerabilities. The combination of falling asset prices, high debt levels, higher debt servicing costs, and stretched asset valuations could continue to expose financial vulnerabilities and lead to further financial market turbulence. Even so, we believe that central banks have no choice but to stay the course with their efforts to bring inflation back to target, and we are confident that they will do precisely that. By way of further risks, pressures on global energy markets could well reappear. We had comparatively favourable conditions this last winter, a milder winter leading to lower demand across Europe, lower demand from China. And of course, that is not necessarily going to be repeated next winter. Indeed, the expectation would be that Chinese demand for LNG would move back from last year's low closer to the previous demand trajectory in the context of the full reopening of the Chinese economy. The most impactful positive change to the global outlook right now would come with a comprehensive, just and lasting peace for Ukraine, consistent with international law. As well as staying the course with monetary policy tightening, we believe fiscal support to cushion the impact of high energy prices must become better targeted. To support monetary policy in tackling inflation, for fiscal sustainability reasons, but also to avoid entrenching undesirable distortionary impacts of blanket fiscal support on demand and supply. So far, it has to be said, when it comes to better targeting of fiscal support, we continue to rather observe the opposite. To reduce supply-side pressures on inflation, it is also important to keep markets open and to resist the temptation of export restrictions and other trade measures. And sadly, here also we are seeing that in the context of the challenges in front of us, that quite a number of countries are opting for export restrictions, which make a challenging situation even more difficult. The many short-term pressures and risks to the global economic outlook come on top of the long-standing structural challenges we continue to face. The increasingly urgent need for globally effective action on climate change, the policy implications of the accelerating and deepening digital transformation of our economies and societies, the impact of population ageing on productivity, growth, and public finances. So while responding to the immediate economic challenges, policymakers must also lay the policy groundwork for growth in the longer term by boosting productivity growth, which is essential to maintain and to improve living standards in the wake of ageing populations. Average productivity growth across OECD economies has halved over the last 20 years. There are several tools available to policymakers to reverse this trend by addressing the growing divergences between firms and at the frontier of productivity growth and the rest. And there is quite a gap, in particular when it comes to the productivity benefits coming from digitalization. This also must include alleviating barriers such as access to finance for smaller firms, effective competition enforcement and digital regulatory frameworks which can help ensure that markets are genuinely contestable by new innovative firms. Those firms also need access to good digital infrastructure to reach their potential. And we need to improve the quality of investments in education and skills to ensure we have the human capital required to underpin productivity growth. Upskilling, reskilling, a commitment to lifelong learning are all important to help ensure workers have the best possible opportunity to participate in the changing labour markets in the wake of the green and digital transformations of our economies. We need to better invest in productivity-enhancing infrastructure, in our energy security and affordability while remaining on track to carbon neutrality by 2050. by harnessing the changing patterns of global migration, which can help address costly skills shortages and the impact of workforce aging. International migration needs to be properly managed and requires a serious commitment to effective economic and social integration. Effective support for mastering the language of the host country is a key lever for successful integration. And here, this is where the new OECD Crete Population Center will serve as a hub for capacity building and policy dialogue on migrant integration, among other population policy-related areas. We need to strengthen multilateral cooperation to tackle the evolving challenges of our time. The more fragile state of our rules-based global order is contributing to a more fragile global economic outlook. We need to recommit ourselves to ensuring a rules-based order, in particular a rules-based international trading system in good working order. Because many of today's challenges transcend national borders. There are several policy areas where global cooperation will be essential for effective policy outcomes. We need to work together better to tackle climate change. In particular, we need to ensure that the efforts in individual jurisdictions to reduce their emissions genuinely help reduce global emissions and don't just shift them to other parts of the world, where for the same level of economic output, they might well be higher than they would have been in the original jurisdiction. In this context, I'm pleased to report that the first meeting of the OECD's Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches, which took place 2 months ago, brought together 104 countries from around the world with more than 600 delegates. All G20 countries except Russia were sitting around the table. This Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches is an initiative designed to help improve the global impact of emissions reduction efforts in individual countries around the world through better data and information sharing, evidence-based mutual learning, and through an inclusive multilateral dialogue. We also need effective global cooperation to address some of the challenges associated with digitalization, which span national borders. Now, for the OECD, one of the things that we've sought to contribute there is our two-pillar reform proposal to make our international tax arrangements fairer and work better in a digitalized, globalized world economy. We need more effective global cooperation to ensure we can have a global rules-based trading system, as I mentioned, in good working order. Yes, let's learn the lessons of the pandemic and the impact of the war in Ukraine on global supply chains. It is entirely sensible to focus on de-risking global supply chains. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's avoid costly decoupling or deglobalization. Let's keep in mind the significant benefits that come in terms of living standards and downward pressure on inflation with open global trade and investment. At the OECD, fostering increased global cooperation is very much part of our DNA. We provide comprehensive data analysis and advice to help inform better policy choices. We provide a platform for evidence-based mutual learning and for international dialogue and cooperation. And we provide standards as instruments and tools to help level the global playing field by encouraging an agreed common approach to shared challenges. And we provide evidence-based policy recommendations to help governments tackle both the immediate challenges over the short term as well as laying the foundations in terms of our long-term priorities, always with our core vision in mind of ensuring or helping governments deliver better policies for better lives. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to say a few words up front, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much. In a very limited time, I think you demonstrated somehow all the major challenges we're facing and how you think we're going to improve the situation. From all those risks that you mentioned, the climate, the geopolitical, the energy, the inflation, which you think is the most important imminent risk, if I may say so?
Well, I mean, I think the most impactful, negative or positively, is the impact on the world economy of Russia's illegal, unprovoked, unjustifiable war of aggression against Ukraine. We don't know how much longer it will last. We don't know how much worse it might get. We don't know what other consequences there could be. And so the level of uncertainty that comes with that and the level of risk associated with how this could develop, I mean, I think the most positive development for the global outlook that we could secure right now is if there was a comprehensive, just and lasting peace for Ukraine, consistent with international law. And of course, I mean, that is within the gift of President Putin to get his troops out of Ukraine and to, which clearly is in the best interests of the people of Ukraine for obvious reasons, also in the best interest, I would argue, of the people of Russia, and it would be in the best interest of people all around the world. But look, I mean, right now, I mean, there are many pressures. There's much risk that needs to be carefully managed. I mean, inflation is a big factor, and it is very important to get inflation under control. And the process of getting inflation under control comes with its own risks. It doesn't mean that and we've seen that with some of the recent bank failures, which we don't believe point to any systemic issues, but nevertheless, when economic conditions become tougher, when the price of money goes up, obviously business models, vulnerabilities in business models get more heavily exposed, and that's what we've been seeing.
You mentioned about the Crete Research Center of OECD, and when I was born, it was decades ago, the global population was 2 billion. Now we're talking about 8 billion, and we're talking all about this demographic situations, Europe, Africa, etc. How do you think this, the research center in Crete possibly, can help on this?
Well, so we see the Crete Center as a dedicated OECD hub, really studying in depth all of the aspects of population policy and contributing like a knowledge base to help inform decisions by governments around the world. And I mean, it goes across the implications of population aging and how best to respond to that. It goes to migratory flows. It goes, and this is of course a regional hub in Crete that is in a very strategic part of the world, between Europe, Asia, Africa. And we've got parts of the world with growing populations, rapidly growing populations, very young populations. We've got other parts of the world with aging and shrinking populations. And there's a lot of thinking to be done on how appropriate policy frameworks can help channel things into the best possible direction.
Thank you very much. We're honored that the Delphi Forum perhaps will be the organizer of this world important population conference in Crete. We're waiting to see the developments in OECD about your advisory board about this, and also about the new government in Greece sometime in mid-July. So I think, by early fall, we need to discuss how we can start working on these important projects. And as you pointed out, Crete is, in the strategic locations, and perhaps we can bring a number of people from the Middle East, from Africa, from Europe, and perhaps from the world to discuss all those important issues. I understand we have 1 more minute. Let me make the final question. How can OECD's expertise help to make the fight against the climate crisis economically effective and possibly sustainable?
Well, I mean, the thing that we can bring to the table, I mean, I think that climate change needs to be approached as a macroeconomic structural challenge, and we really need to have a multidisciplinary approach to this. And at the OECD, I mean, that is our bread and butter looking at policy challenges in a multidisciplinary sense. So we will bring our expertise in terms of facilitating more systematic mapping and data, comparative data and information analysis of the efforts in countries around the world to bring their emissions down. We'll also be seeking to
facilitate evidence-based mutual learning so that good practices and what works well over here might be able to be adapted and work well elsewhere, but also really to facilitate a more qualitative, inclusive and evidence-based conversation between advanced, emerging and developing economies around how to ensure that the efforts in individual jurisdictions actually help solve the global challenge.
Absolutely.
Because, in the end, emissions don't stop at anyone's border. And the decisions that are made in one jurisdiction can have flow-on implications economically and climate-wise in other jurisdictions. And unless the efforts in individual jurisdictions help to bring down emissions at a global level, then we're not really making the progress that we need to make. And that is where the OECD, I believe, can make a real difference.
Absolutely. If I may reassure you that we're going to do our utmost in order to support the center in Crete, to organize a beautiful conference on populations, and I hope that you will join us next year as well. And thank you deeply for coming. Ladies and gentlemen, the Secretary General.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.